Welcome to Exercise Physiology for the Horse Rider. My name is Jenny Louise Douglas and I'm a Visiting Associate Principal Lecturer at Hartpury College, HE Equine Sciences. I'm currently based on Vancouver Island and that's why I'm going to be giving this lecture to you remotely. Enjoy and please ask any questions that you might have. Questions that you want to ask me off the back of this lecture, then if you email them to me, and I'll put my email at the end of the lecture, I can do either an email response or I can do, if there's enough questions, a question and answer video and then post that, and then Vicky can put that up for you so that you feel like you're getting a little bit of a connection and a communication with me, because even though I'm not leading this module and I'm only teaching a little part on it now, I'm really interested in rider fitness and rider performance, and I just love having any sort of connection with that. So we're going to talk a little bit about physiological demands of horse riding. There isn't a massive amount of research on it, so it's going to be more about me sort of giving you food for thought and getting you to sort of just think about it in a wider context. One thing I would suggest that you read is the chapter in this book, if you can get it, or if you can photocopy it, Training for Equestrian for Performance. And then if you go to this section 2, there's a chapter on human exercise physiology and biomechanics. Just for those of you that perhaps haven't done physiology for a little while, I can't obviously give you all the background of physiology, so it might just be a nice little refresher. And the content in there isn't too heavy, so it should be just helpful to your backup. And also, a lot of this lecture is based on the paper I wrote in 2012 that you should be able to get in comparative exercise physiology, and that's the systematic review of physiological and physical demands of horse riding. So some of this information's come from there. So the plan for today is to take you through physical and physiological demands of horse riding, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about my research. And I've got some questions that I want you to think about, and then Vicky can either pause or I'll leave some gaps in the lecture for you to work with. But obviously I can't have that two-way dynamic with you, so do ask Vicky or whoever's in the room at the moment if you have a question that you want answering, or jot it down and I can get to you afterwards. So hope you enjoy. Okay, so thinking about physiology then, the general aim of physiological training, the general aim of training you in the gym is to do a number of things. Extend time to fatigue. So we want to be able to get you to perform at your peak before you get to any fatigue state. And we want to enhance your performance. And now whether that's by, so when you get fatigued, sometimes your mental concentration lacks, your skill and coordination decreases. And as a mentally concentrative sport, that's something that you don't really want when you're on top of the horse. You don't want your concentration and any associated bad decisions to be made because you're physiologically tired. So an enhanced performance. And within that category also comes offsetting injury or reducing rate of injury. So there are three main goals of physiology or training in general. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at like determinants of performance, so what type of physical characteristics make a rider, and then what type of physiological basis or physiological characteristics riders might require. And I've already sort of mentioned that it would be a good idea to get a backup of the Human Ex-Phys chapter in the Training for Equestrian Performance book, and there's the title of my paper there, so you should be able to find it. I can always ping that over to Vicky if she doesn't have it, so that you can read it. So in terms of what is physical and what is physiological demand, the way I think of it is that physiological demand is something that's happening inside your body, and the physical demands are the traits or the attributes that you have as a result of those physiological demands. So for example, somebody that is anthropometrically lean, long, quite endomorphic or esomorphic, or they have physical traits. So for example, like a basketballer, typically long and lean, and then you have a sprinter that might be more muscular, more powerful compared to a marathon runner. They're physical traits that indicate their physiological attributes. And we see this in breed characteristics in horses as well. Obviously, thinking about horse riders, we don't necessarily see that classic physical appearance that you would see in other sports. So, you can generally pick out, if I got a group of rugby players in the room, with some accuracy you'd be able to predict who are forwards and who are backs. Some say you can do that with horse riders, but we've done a few studies and it hasn't necessarily been what we thought so far. But obviously the nature of horse riding doesn't lend itself to have any particular performance trait that we know of, and therefore the physical appearance of these riders isn't necessarily setting them apart. So physiological demand is something that is occurring in the body, and it is quite difficult to measure sometimes. It's something that you need a lot of kit to measure, and that's why physiological demands of equestrianism, it's my little one upstairs, physiological demands of equestrianism hasn't been that well researched, because you kind of need the equipment that you would have in a sporting facility, and that's why we're starting to see more and more research come about in equestrian sports. Okay, so why do we need an understanding of the physical and physiological demands of horse riding? It's something that I've been seeking to understand for the last 6 or so years. We can get some understanding of the physical. I mean, you can use a bit of common sense, and we can look at the demands of the sport from a heart rate perspective fairly easily. Although we know the relative inaccuracy with measuring heart rates. So why we need to know the demand of sport and why we need to know if there's any physical demands that discriminate is one of the things we do before we plan a training programme, particularly when we're looking at general preparation for athletes, and when we're looking at sports performance rather than just physical training, we want to know exactly what happens when that rider is competing and or training, so that we can mimic those physiological demands. And that doesn't necessarily mean replicate the position, but mimic those physiological demands in the field, in the gym-based situation, so that we can work with them off the horse that is going to pretty much accurately transfer to their riding ability. Why would we want to know if there's any physical determinants or discriminators in performance? Well, if we know that X performs at this trait, then we can make this person more like this, and therefore won't necessarily make them a better rider, but it should transfer to their riding better. And that's the difficulty when you're looking at the horse-rider relationship. There's so many things, so many variables that could contribute to enhanced performance, that their physical preparation is just going to be one part of that. And by no means is it necessarily as important as physical training might be in other sports. So, for example, your marathon runners, your sprinters, their physical training is very, very important to their success. And I'm not saying that physical training isn't important to equestrian success, but riding the horse, riding as many horses as you can, and developing that skill is always going to be more pertinent than riding off the horse. But if we're going to start to strength and condition our riders, and if we're going to start doing off-horse ancillary training to supplement their riding, then we want to make damn sure that it's actually going to work. And therefore we need to have this understanding. Whether it's anecdotal or research depends on what hat you're wearing, but we still need to have an understanding of this. And with my academic hat on, I need to understand it from a pretty much numbers point of view to be able to evidence it. Okay, so this slide is talking about how we can measure physiological and physical demands. Now, because I'm not with you, I can't have this discursive chat with you. So I'm probably going to put the lecture on hold, or I'll ask Vicky to pause it for a couple of minutes so that you can have a discussion within the group. So what I want you to do now is list as many measures that you can think that you could measure, either physical or physiological demands, not necessarily just for riders, just in general. And then I would like you to have a think about how and why you couldn't do it with riders if that's what you were thinking about doing. So I'll probably leave this up for 2 minutes for you to have a think about, and then I'll come back and give you some of my thoughts and see if they're on your list. Okay, so hopefully you've had a couple of minutes to jot some ideas down. So let's think about a physiological demand. So how are we going to measure what's happening inside the body? Okay, so hopefully you might have mentioned heart rate. So we can record heart rate. Polar is the model that I'm sponsored by, so they're obviously the first model that I probably use. They are used very widely in research, and they have been, their validity and their reliability has been evidenced quite widely. And you can record in 2-second intervals, 5-second intervals, and you can change the interval rate that you record. I use 2 seconds for my research, but most use 5 or under. And you can measure the heart rate variability, so the space between beats, and that can record things like overtraining, stress. You can just record heart rate. And the reason we record heart rate is because heart rate is generally linearly related to oxygen consumption, which we'll talk about in a minute. And therefore you can use heart rate in most sports, and I keep saying this because it's going to lead me to something I come back to in the end. You can use heart rate in most sports to predict relative intensity of exercise. So heart rate can be used, but there are things that can affect heart rate. So things like, even things like your mental state, but it can be things like anxiety, it can be things like medication. I mean, there's lots of things that can affect heart rate. The way you've recorded it, it's a very good measure, but put it this way, if you're trying to get a paper published in a physiological journal, heart rate alone isn't going to get you there. So it's a good measure for practitioners. So if I was working with my riders, I would probably use heart rate because it's more real life situation than some of the other measures we're going to talk about, but I just want you to be aware of the pros and cons, and it might be worth you reading up about the pros and cons. In terms of oxygen consumption that we just discussed, you can measure sort of cardiorespiratory variables using either lab-based or telemetric, so away from the lab, so you can get people running with it on, rowing with it on, horse riding with it on, and they wear a gas mask, and then they have a known gas concentration in a canister, and it works out how much oxygen they are taking in and how much carbon dioxide they're breathing out, and it can work out the relative amount of oxygen that they have had to use. And then you can work out oxygen uptake, and then you can work out maximal oxygen uptake, which is usually done in a laboratory situation. And the reason we would want to understand oxygen consumption would be, it gives us an understanding of, in more detail than what the heart rate can do, aerobic demand. So how fit, essentially, aerobically, they need to be. And because it's an aerobic sport, or we presume at the moment it's an aerobic sport, it's one of the measures that we probably want to understand in more detail. There's a whole plethora of things we can measure, but the main ones are those two, and then blood lactate. So if you read your physiology chapter in here, you'll understand a little more about blood lactate accumulation. And when you think about your energy systems, we always are using one of our energy sources, and in the anaerobic system, lactate acid or lactate is a byproduct, so it's a toxic product of that energy system, and it is a main contributor to fatigue, so it's one of our fatigue metabolites. And essentially, the more we have of that, the more anaerobic it is, and the less aerobic the exercise is. So horse riding is generally aerobic, but we do see an accumulation of blood lactate, particularly as we start to move towards jumping type manoeuvres. So if I was to measure your blood lactate in the room now, it'd probably be anywhere between 0 and 2 millimoles. And then at max exercise, we'd be looking at 8 millimoles or above. And then I think the highest I've recorded in riders whilst riding is about 9, and the lowest is like literally baseline. So, when I've been testing dressage riders, it's usually 2.5 mils. That's like very, very low, indicates it's mostly aerobic. And in show jumping and cross country, it has gone up to peaks of 9 and averages of about 5 mils. So again, there is some anaerobic contribution, but it's relatively moderate. There are other things we can measure. You could measure blood hormone. Things like, you could also measure things like cortisol in the blood. You could measure urine. You could measure blood pressure. I'm thinking physiological rather than mechanical. There's quite a few different measures, so hopefully you and Vicky and the group have come up with some, but they're your main physiological ones. Now, in terms of physical, you could think about things like skin fold testing, height, weight. You could do weighing it either underwater or using different scanners that can measure different body compositions. So there's lots of things that we can do to measure physical and physiological demands, but the physiological demands are much more difficult to get our hands on, and you need quite advanced pieces of kit. So have a look at your list, see if I've added into that, and then as a homework, it would probably be a good idea to have a little read about those and why we might use them and why we might not. Okay, so in terms of the current research, this slide probably fine for physiology. There hasn't been a huge amount of physiology. I know there's actually one other paper, so I'll have to dig it out for you, that's looking at blood lactate and attention in show jumpers, which might be worth finding as well. But these are some of your key papers. Now, the thing with physiology in equestrian sports is it's quite limited in terms of what's been done. It spans from 1983 to 2010, and some of my research has been done now. And like I said, there's some blood lactate stuff coming out. And that doesn't mean people aren't doing the research, it just means it's not getting disseminated. And that's what we need. We can't really conclusively say these results are valid until it's been peer reviewed. So we're kind of waiting on people to get some stuff out there. But then I'm going to leave you need to read these papers. I can't give you all the information from them. But essentially what we're starting to find is that, my critique of this literature is that there's no holistic approach to finding an outcome. It's all quite willy-nilly, different countries, different researchers, different sports. And equestrianism is such a big sport, and there's so many disciplines that are involved. The demands on a rider doing a national hunt race are going to be so different to demands of a rider doing dressage. So how can we possibly start to characterise them into the same group of populations for horse riding? And also the demands, presumably, I don't actually know the answer, but presumably the demands between different levels of competition are massively different as well. So when you look at, for example, Myers, who's done, an equitation, like the effect of horse riding on your, how physiologically demanding it is and whether it improves your fitness, was done in recreational, collegiate riders. Well, that's going to be so completely different to if you had, I've forgotten the word I'm trying to find. Basically, an intern at a yard that's riding 6 horses a day at novice event level. It's a completely different type of demand. So I don't think when you're reading this research and you're saying, an equitation intervention doesn't have any effect on performance or physical fitness. Well, no, that intervention didn't, but it doesn't mean that no equestrian intervention is going to. So I think we just need to be careful about our interpretation of these papers. And I think we need to really, myself and other researchers, I think we need to find out what it is we're trying to find out. I know what I'm trying to find out from this research, but I think we need to find out what is needed from the research so that we can all work together to come up with a picture, because at the moment there isn't really one clear message. It's all quite bitty. But there's some really good stuff. The Roberts et al. Paper was something I was interested in because that's in eventing. And even though it was a simulated competition, so this is the other thing, a lot of these are set up, nothing's in competition. They're all either set up or just walk, trot, canter. So we really have to question how replicative that is to actual riding. But yeah, have a look at this research. There's some interesting findings out there that give us a little bit of a platform about, where we're at with physiological research at the moment. So let's think about the physical characteristics of riders then. We've already kind of discussed a little bit about the body type of riders. So do you think, these are 2 show jumpers, relatively similar show jumping levels, does their body type look the same? What do you think? I hope you're talking to each other. What's different, without being rude? Try and be PC. What's different? Are the horses' body types the same? Why do you think I picked show jumping? Do you think riders need to be fit to compete well? That's a question for you. Do you think it would help in any way? Do you think there are certain sports where certain disciplines where you need to be fitter and other disciplines where you can get away without being fit. Equestrian sport is quite strange in the fact that you train far longer than you compete. You might compete for 2 minutes, might compete for 5, might be longer, depending on the discipline, obviously. But most people train longer than that, whereas in a lot of other sports, your total training time in the day might be 3 hours, but that's in 40-minute blocks. And the competition time might actually be an hour and a half. So it's difficult for us to program when you're actually really programming them for their training, not for their competing. Especially things like dressage, like the amount they need to be able to do is actually to be able to cope with their training load, not necessarily their competitive load. Something for you to think about and talk about. So let's think about then physical fitness. When we're looking at the research at the moment, there's quite limited competitive focus, and I want you to think about why this might be important. Because for me, as it says in the box there, you have the same action, so these two riders are doing the same thing, but do you think there's the same demand? It's definitely not for the horse. Do you think the demand's the same for the rider? And bear in mind, I don't have the answer to this yet, but I know what I think, and I know why I think that. Think about, for example, how muscle action can affect physiology, because it's mechanics physiology, it's that neuromuscular link. You know, if you have a higher amplitude muscle contraction, physiologically that's going to be more demanding, surely. So if this rider is having to brace, this rider on the right is having to brace their spine and their abdominal and core musculature far greater than the person on the left, which they might not have to, bear in mind, if they're more advanced and their timing's better, this person on the left it might be more demanding for them because they're not so fit. So again, I'm not suggesting. It just depends on the fitness of the individual, doesn't it? And this is why the research is very difficult. But generally speaking, jumping a higher fence is going to be more demanding than jumping a lower fence for the same person. That doesn't mean that these two different people aren't experiencing the same demand. But generally speaking, the more muscle activation there is, the higher the physiological demand. So if this person's going to have to resist translational forces on landing from a higher jump, presumably for this rider on the right, it would be harder to jump the jump on the right than it would be the left. In terms of competitive focus, what I'm trying to say here is that for the same person, at least, going between different disciplines is going to be different. Now, Vicky and I have had this chat a long time because, we kind of had this quite good discussion about the fact that, advanced riders might not find it that more physiologically demanding to ride an advanced track than they do a novice track because they're already at that fitness capacity. Whereas if you ask a novice rider to suddenly go around an advanced track, bear in mind the fact that the skill level would cock up that idea, but let's say that they could do it, they might find it more demanding because they haven't been exposed to that physiological stress. Does that make sense? So yeah, so I think it's important that we have a competitive focus with our research so that we can actually truly understand the demands of the sport so that we can train our riders most effectively. So we're going to go through the physiological demands in a little bit more detail. I need you to read the papers for this to make thorough sense. So we can measure, maximal oxygen consumption, as I've already kind of stated, is the amount of oxygen that the muscles use. Usually we do it per minute, and we formulate a number for that. And I won't go into the detail of it, but basically the higher the number, the more oxygen your body is capable of getting in and then using. So you could have two people that could be at the same fitness capacity, but for whatever reason, person A is fitter than person B. You also are genetically predetermined to have a different VO2 max, and that is usually determined on the type of muscles that you have. So put it this way, if you didn't have a genetic capacity to be a marathon runner, you're not going to be able to make it. Now, you with training, so if you have someone that has a much better work ethic than somebody that's naturally gifted in this way, yes, you can be better than them. But what I'm saying is somebody that has an innate, very low maximal oxygen consumption, it's going to be very difficult for them to attain a very high VO2 max. VO2 max is something that all athletes in aerobic sports achieve. So things like cycling, downhill skiing, running, anything that VO2 max is the thing. It's the gold standard measure of aerobic capacity, and it's what these people strive to have the highest number. Now, do the riders need to have a high VO2 max? No, not really. But it is a good indicator of their current fitness, and it's an indicator of how hard their body's working aerobically whilst riding. So it is a good measure for us to use, but we don't want to get carried away into this whole needing a high VO2 max, because it's not necessarily high compared to these other athletes. And bear in mind, like when you start to do some Google research, because I've asked you there to find out VO2 max in other athletic populations, I want you to just bear in mind who these people that you're reading from. Basically what I'm trying to say is the top people in these sports may well be blood doping, and therefore their VO2 max might be higher because they've just injected a load of extra red blood cells into their body, and therefore they've got greater ability to have a higher, like my washing machine's going off, a greater ability to have a higher VO2 max than somebody that's not doping. So when you read up like Lance Armstrong had VO2 max of 90 mils per minute or something. Anyway, so you can measure VO2 max on basically any mode of exercise, but what we try to achieve is whole body exercise. So your cycloergometers and your treadmills are most effective. Now when you read the literature, you're going to hear the term VO2 max a lot, but there's a lot of the time, unless your research is in a very high rated journal, you're probably talking about VO2 peak than VO2 max, because VO2 max is pretty hard to achieve, and a lot of people won't take themselves to VO2 max. A lot of people will stop beforehand, and that's where we call it VO2 peak. So in my research, we call it VO2 peak because they haven't reached a true plateau in their VO2 kinetics. Some of you will be like, oh yeah, and some of you will be sitting there like, what is she talking about? Don't worry about it too much. You're not going to get exam question on VO2 kinetics. But what we're trying to say is basically the mechanics of oxygen uptake in the body, and there's different things we look for. So you could have two people that have the same VO2 max, but one person just gets to a relative percentage of max higher and stays there, and effectively they're fitter, even though the same two people have the same VO2 max. So there's a lot we need to understand about it before we can really discuss it in detail. But what I'm trying to present to you here is just some of the numbers that you're going to see from the research, and my paper will have all this in it, so I'm just kind of giving you the information. So have a read of the paper, but I've said there what is most appropriate, cycloergometers and treadmills. Okay, so a cycloergometer is safer, so I can't call it a bike because the cycloerg doesn't have two wheels, it has one wheel, and I get shot for that all the time. So basically the cycloerg is a safer measure, particularly with riders that haven't necessarily pushed themselves to max, proper like physical exhaustion, going to fall off the treadmill kind of max. So it's safer. However, you generally don't get, unless you're well trained on a bike, you generally won't get a true VO2 max. And I did a study for my study 3, and I looked at the same person on a horse, bike, treadmill, and they got like 10 mils higher on a treadmill every time. So basically what we're trying to say is the treadmill is more appropriate if you're trying to get the highest measure for that person. If you're just trying to understand the relationship between the heart rate and the VO2, or you're just trying to understand a pattern of something that's happening, then the cycloergometer would be fine. That would be my suggestion. Is there a high importance for a VO2 max? Essentially, if your VO2 max is higher, you have a higher aerobic capacity and you're going to have the ability to offset fatigue. When we do VO2 max, we generally test lactate at the same time, because like I said, you could have two people that have same VO2 max, and one person has a lactate of, 10 mils at the end, and someone else has a lactate of 5 at the end. The one that has 5 at the end is generally going to be able to withstand fatigue better than the one that has 10. So when we're looking at the numbers, roughly around 40 mils is what we're getting from riders at the moment. All my studies were within about 40 to 45 mils per kilogram per minute, and we see 33 there for Myers and 43 there for Westerling. So we see it's around there. That's not very high. It's not low either. It's like a moderate, it's like somebody that went to the gym. That's sort of, it's not athletic, put it that way. Athletic, you'd be looking at 50 plus. And I did get that with some riders, and then you find out they run for a running club, but they run regularly. So you need to understand like the background of the riders when you test them. So I want you to, probably not now, probably at the end of the lecture, I want you to find out some VO2 maxes from other athletic populations and choose some that are wild. Maybe look at one that's like a dynamic sport, so something like running, and then maybe look at something in like something that's similar to horse riding, so things like, surfing or sailing or something like that, something that's a travel sport, and then have a comparison and see what you think. So is horse riding anaerobic? No, not really. I mean, Myers did a test in the lab, and since then no one's really bothered to do it because they sort of suggested there was no indication of anaerobic power. So they basically get them on a cycle erg and just get them to do max power, and then they measure their power output and indicate that riders weren't particularly powerful. Do you need to be really powerful? No, not really. If you think about it, you know, compared to like a power athlete, like a sprinter or a basketballer, do you need to really be able to jump or propel yourself? Not really. You need to, like, particularly eventers and national hunt riders and things, you probably need to have quite a good hip thrust. So some sort of power from the lower back hip complex, but it's not power in true sense of the word power. So we haven't really looked at power in riders as we've gone on, and the anaerobic energy pathways certainly aren't recruited to a particularly high level. So I think what we can say at the moment is there is some anaerobic contribution, but you don't need to perform highly in any anaerobic performance tests that we know of at the moment for horse riders. So muscular strength and endurance is something that hasn't massively been investigated in our population. I have started to do, I did some EMG studies for my final trial, and I did look at isokinetic dynamometry. And this is basically a machine. I've got some pictures of it coming up, I think. And you can measure, it's a gold standard measure for strength. So it's gold standard, and it's better than sort of 1RM testing, so 1 rep max testing and things like that. So there has been some EMG studies by Terada predominantly. And again, like an EMG study is a very difficult thing to do. It requires a lot of knowledge about the EMG equipment. It actually requires having the equipment and then placement and actual. It's just such a complicated measure that you only want to do it if you A, truly know what you're doing, and B, have the time to analyse the data, because analysing the data takes a lot longer than actually measuring it, which is stressful. But so far, Terada has indicated that, now she's only looked at walk and trot in flat. So that, you know, what you require to do walk and trot versus jump out hunting or whatever is completely different. But anyway, regards to the walk and trot, it implies that the muscular endurance is required for a long period in static contraction, and that certainly is the case with most equestrian sports. We don't have massive flailing of arms, flailing of legs, and the main thing is the trunk movement that we see and the hip sort of complex. So we see movement, but not as dynamic as we do in other sports. So yes, a lot of the time the requirement is for isometric contraction. Westerling, way back in the day, found no differences in strength between equestrians and their control counterpart. And Alfredson actually found the opposite, and he actually found that riders had quite high muscle strength compared to low bone density, which is never a good thing. So there's very little been done at the moment, and we don't really know what muscles are recruited for what activity. We don't know when the timing is, and so Terada would be your best place to start. But do they actually are riders actually stronger than their non-riding counterparts? At the moment, the research suggests no. So thinking about muscular strength and endurance again, Myers, who's a professor in America, has done some like practical field-based tests rather than just like lab-based tests. And he's looked at things like curl-ups, reverse sit-ups, back extensions and press-ups. And he's looked at these sort of pre-inequitation intervention and post-inequitation intervention. And there wasn't much difference apart from sit-ups, which went up quite a bit actually. So I'd question that a little bit, because that's 27 sit-ups per minute extra. That's quite a lot extra. But anyway, these tests, you can like make them standardised, but they're quite difficult to do so, and that's the problem with like these types of tests. You know, they're quite useful for like if you're actually working with an athlete, but trying to incorporate them into a scientific paper is a little difficult. And I did find a couple on plank to fatigue and how you can standardise that. But yeah, it's not the easiest thing to do. But what we're seeing at the moment is horse riding itself, and we've got to remember here we're talking about like a standard equitation lesson, so nothing to the level that you might see in some riding establishments. Doesn't really have an effect on strength, apart from weirdly here that the sit-ups. So if we just summarise the physical demands, what we know at the moment is in terms of when we're looking at equestrian population, there's limited information available. We haven't got much to go on. At the moment, we know that the populations that have been used are sub-elite and mostly female athletes. We can gather from the data that a maximum aerobic capacity and strength alone are not going to be limiting factors for horse riders. And to be honest, if they were, we would see more men competing at the top echelons of the sport than women, and that isn't something that we see in our sport. So I'm not saying that having a higher aerobic capacity and better strength is going to prevent you from being a better rider. In my opinion, it would make you better, but it's not going to be the only limiting factor. The equitation interventions, the walk, trot, canter intervention that was more like a collegiate lesson, didn't improve health and fitness. But we need to criticise this equitation intervention, because is that really replicative of what you're going to see in a competitive situation in a training yard? I mean, it doesn't, in my opinion, necessarily conclude that horse riding can't improve fitness characteristics, or doesn't lend itself to have certain physical traits in riders that we see in non-rider traits. So I think more work needs to be done in this area for sure. So thinking about the physiological demands whilst riding then, we discussed briefly in a previous slide about the measures, so heart rate, blood lactate, oxygen uptake. And we know that there's inherent variability in physiologic responses between disciplines. There hasn't been a lot of research looking at discipline-specific information, but looking at the sort of walk, trot, canter information that we get from Westerling and then Debian, looking at the racing in Trowbridge, the show jumping in Guterres Recon, the polo in Wright and Peters, and then the eventing in Roberts, and what's the other one? But basically what we see from those is as the gaits increase, so if we go from walk to trot to canter to gallop, we see the physiological demand becoming more demanding. So we know that the forward seat position and the out of the seat position has an effect on how difficult it is for the rider. So we know that it is more difficult to be out of your seat and be jumping than it is to be in your seat. We also know, some of my research is evidencing that sitting trot is physiologically more demanding than both the canter and the rising trot, which doesn't seem much of a surprise to me. I'm going to leave you to read the papers and critique the numbers, because that's something, this is for me to guide you, and this is for you to do the work. But I want you to go and have a look at the numbers and start to compare the numbers between the dressage, the show jumping, the eventing, and come up with a picture that you look at the heart rate, look at the blood lactate. What does it mean? Is it comparable? Is it different? And whilst you're doing that, I want you to critique the environment, because a lot of them are simulated setups, and I don't think any of them are actually in competition. So you need to ask yourself how that's going to affect the data. How's that going to affect heart rate data? Probably won't affect oxygen uptake and blood lactate too much, but it certainly would have an effect on the heart rate. So the main thing I'm trying to say to you is, as we get into that forward seat position, that jump position, the demands become harder for us as riders. And we need to think about that when we start to interpret that into training. So if we take a look at heart rate then, this is just a couple of information about from papers by Westerling, Guterres Recon and Trowbridge. So you've got a bit of dressage, a bit of show jumping and a bit of race riding here. So you can look at the heart rate. So we can see that the heart rate significantly increases from walk to canter. So for those of you that aren't common with typical heart rates, your heart rate where you're sitting now, it depends on your age and your fitness, but you're shooting for anywhere between sort of 50 and probably 70 just sitting. 172 beats for me now would be fairly high, but if you're 20 then perhaps that's not so high. So again, your age is going to affect your heart rate. So it's all very relative to the individual. So when you do these types of heart rate analysis, usually you would find out a person's heart rate max, or there are predictions like there's the old one, which is 220 minus your age, and there's some other ones that you can do to predict what you would expect a percentage of max, because it's a much more relative measure. So to say somebody's working 80% max, because you could have a heart rate of 172 and be at 70% max, and I could have a heart rate of 172 and be at 95% max. So working at the relative intensity is a more sort of accurate estimation of how hard you're actually working. But you can see with the show jumping, seeing that they didn't actually, in this paper, this is one of the critiques of the paper, didn't actually list the heart rate, so they've gone from relative. So the other thing to critique is they're going from absolute to relative measures in different papers. There's very little consistency, but we're seeing about 90% of your heart rate max during a show jump effort. Now that's quite high, but then we have to remember that how long does it take to jump 13 show jumps like 2.5 minutes, 2 minutes, if that. So we're getting quite a high heart rate, but it's only for a short period of time. So then we need to ask ourselves, well, do you need to be that fit to have a high heart rate? So we've got some more heart rate data here from Desian and Guzanek, Wright and Peters and Roberts. So we're seeing a similar pattern here. So as we walk through from walk to show jumping, we're seeing heart rate go from 100, which is similar to what we saw in the wrestling paper, up to 176 beats for show jumping. Wright and Peters, we saw a range from 99 to 182 beats per minute, average about 150. Again, it would be better if we had these in percentages, so you might want to go back through the papers and have a look. You could probably work out percentages if they listed the average age of the rider. You could do it off a 220 minus age and then work out the percentage of heart rate max, because then it will give you an estimation of, you know, like how intense it is for that population. And then we're seeing a similar thing in Roberts, and Roberts is your most like simulated competition. So we're seeing dressage 172 beats per minute, show jump 180, cross country 184, and these are similar numbers to what I was getting in my research, and that's quite high. But we have to remember it's only, I mean, the dressage and the cross country phase at novice level is about 5 minutes, and then show jumping is about 2.5. So it's not, you know, show jumping and cross country is similar, but show jumping is for a less period of time. So in some ways you could suggest that perhaps show jumping is more demanding than cross country. But it depends, probably more anaerobically demanding, and cross country is more aerobic with anaerobic contribution, I think. I think it's important to remember the relative time that they're competing for, and it would be really interesting to compare like a cross-country training lesson to a cross-country tracks like competition and see like relative intensity. So when we're thinking about lactate accumulation, we're thinking about how much demand there is from the anaerobic system. So we haven't got an awful lot of data on lactates. So I've presented 3 pieces of information here, and that's Gutierrez Recon, so ranges from 4 to 6.3, and that's in show jumping. So that's actually quite a significant amount. You know, it's indicating that the anaerobic system is supplementary and above lactate threshold. So it does indicate that. So lactate threshold is typically about 4 mils. So it's indicating here that like there could be some skill-related fatigue or some physiological fatigue as a result of lactate buildup. So to me, this suggests that if you are show jumping, then you should implement a physiological training program to offset fatigue for riders. That's what it's indicating to me. Same for show jump, same for national hunt racing, and the same for cross country. I mean, that doesn't mean you don't need to do a training program for dressage riders or anything that doesn't accumulate lactate, but what it indicates to me here is we need to be pushing these riders to above lactate threshold in their training. So because it's only 5 minutes, I tend to do like more high intensity interval training with my event riders, and anybody that was show jumping, I would do more circuit based training, like high intensity interval circuit based training. Whereas with a dressage rider, I might typically do like a lower level typical circuit based training, so like where you're constantly moving, whereas with the high intensity interval training it would be much higher intensity with periods of rest. That's probably how I would interpret that. Now when we're looking at this Roberts data, I think it's just really important to mention that when they presented the information, because 9.5 mils is quite high, but when I've studied a similar thing, so I've taken bloods from the field, and I did get 9 a couple of times from 1 or 2 people, but my average was still only 5, and that was actually in competition. And I speculate, I don't know, but I think what might have happened with this paper is because it was simulated, I suspect they might have gone from dressage to show jumping to cross country like without very much rest in between, whereas the riders I was working with would have gone back to baseline lactate in between, because some of them had like an hour and up to 4 hours in between phases, so they would have recovered, which is why we did it in competition, because we wanted to actually know the demand of competition. But I suspect that if the simulation didn't have much rest, that would be why the lactate accumulated. But it would be interesting to then, I mean, there's so much stuff we could do, but it would be interesting to see how much rest you need in between to fully recover, because it would only benefit the rider if they were accumulating less lactate. So that's something that if any of you are interested in, you could study, you know, how long it takes to recover post cross country phase or post show jump phase. So gas analysis is something that I'm really interested in, and I think I'm one of very few people that have actually measured gas analysis whilst the person's actually riding a horse. And as a horse rider progresses through the gaits, the metabolic cost of riding increases, and you've got some numbers there to give you an idea. So you can see, like, basically you can either measure it in litres per minute or millilitres per kilogram per minute, but either way you're just looking at the overall absolute number. So you can see, if you look at the top row, that oxygen consumption increases as you go from walk to canter. Not very much difference between sitting and rising trot. They didn't record jumping. And then Debbie and Guzenek, you can see that it increases quite significantly from walk to jumping. So we do know that it does increase. It's quite difficult to, if you look at the Devian paper, it does say that depending on the type of horse you're riding will depend on how difficult it is in terms of your requirement for oxygen. And I can tell you now that I've ridden horses where I barely feel anything, and I've ridden other horses where I feel like I'm about to die, and my fitness hasn't changed within one day. So I definitely agree with that. So then we need to think about our population of horses whilst we're selecting or doing tests, or ways that we can standardise it, and one of those ways might be a mechanical horse, but I can tell you now I've done studies on mechanical horse versus live horse, and it doesn't replicate it from a physiological perspective in any way, shape or form. The heart rate doesn't match, the lactate doesn't match, and the gas analysis is like less than half what you get on a real horse. So from a standardised point of view, the mechanical horse is relatively effective. We've done some research about heart rate actually and presented it in Canada this year. Vicky, myself, Lucy and some others. And we actually proved that the mechanical horse is quite useful for biomechanical analysis, but it's not from a physiological point of view. The one we've got anyway. Maybe some of the other models might be more replicative. I don't think they would be, but it would be interesting to test it. So thinking about gas analysis, if we look at the Roberts paper, because that's the only one to date that's actually measured with the mask on the horse, and they got 20 mils. So bearing in mind our max values for horse riders on average is about 40 mils per kilogram per minute, and these riders in the Roberts paper, I'm pointing because I've got that up on my screen, these people in the these riders in the Roberts paper didn't actually go and do a VO2 max test in the lab, so they predicted VO2 max based on heart rate, which is a relatively stable indicator of VO2 max, but it's not. It would have been better to get them in the lab. So if we're saying their max is 40 and then they're working at 31 mils in the lab, that indicates that they're working at 90% of their VO2 max. So I was like, when I read this, I was like, well, so if riders are working at 90% of the VO2 max, why are their VO2 so low? If having a high VO2 max, or if a rider's working at a high percentage of their VO2 max, then surely they need to be fitter, or should be fitter. So I'll leave you to have some discussion around that, but something just seems a little off to me here. But they actually measured it, so either the max is off, or that's not quite right. But it could be that we're working at 90% of our VO2 max, but because it's only for 5 minutes of time, we're not really, that's why we're getting such high lactate. Essentially what I think is that I do think that it's a demanding sport, and I do think that we need to be training our athletes to perform better, particularly in our disciplines where we're out of the seat. So hopefully, I don't want you to go away from this lecture thinking that riders need to be like, Paula Radcliffe and now running marathons, but I certainly hope it opens your eyes that some of the physiological data does lean towards the fact that riders should be training to offset fatigue, because it's more than anything a mentally concentrated sport, and if they're fatigued, they're not going to be fatigued to the point that they can't ride the horse, but they might be it's not like they're going to fall off and faint from overexhaustion, but it might be to the point where they can't make a good decision, and that, when you're riding half a ton of horse, is probably a situation you'd want to avoid if you could. So that's why, one of the reasons I would encourage riders to train off the horse, particularly in this discipline. So now I get to talk to you just a little bit about my research. So what I've done so far is just given you a précis of some of the physiological literature that's out there. There is not a huge amount. So what you need to do off the back of this lecture really is, if there's anything you thought, I don't really understand that. So if you don't understand heart rate and how it aligns with VO2, then you need to go and sit down with a text and have a read of that. If you don't really understand blood lactate accumulation, maybe just spend 15 minutes on each topic and just have a read so that you can put it into context with the riding. And like I said, if you have any questions, just ask me and I will answer them for you, because that's the difficult thing about teaching you remotely. I can't gauge if you're following me or if you're not. And that's okay. And if you're not, I'm here like on email all the time. You know, you have access to me as your principal lecturer, you have access to me as a exercise physiologist, so I'm more than happy for you to contact me and ask me questions. So I'm just going to give you a few bits of information about my research. So I started doing my PhD in rider performance when I discovered there wasn't a lot of information out there. And my main, one of the things that I love to do is I love to train off the horse. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's CrossFit, it doesn't matter if it's bodybuilding, doesn't matter if it's triathlon training, doesn't matter if it's like Olympic lifting or powerlifting. I don't care. I just love being in the gym. I love lifting, and I love seeing how the body reacts to different stimuluses, regardless of whether that's for the rider or any athlete. So training's always been a passion of mine. So I went and did some PT stuff and some UK SCA qualifications, and then I decided that I wanted to study it in more detail. So originally my research was going to be about strength and conditioning interventions and how strength and conditioning interventions can improve performance. But before we could do that, I needed to understand, the physiological demands of the sport and the physical determinants of the sport. So they're the two things I needed to understand. So I started to do that. I'll talk about it in a minute, about how we got there. But what you can see in front of you at the moment is some pictures of, I'll get shot wearing a hoodie. That's not a good picture. I shouldn't have been wearing a hoodie. That's a picture of me on the left with actually Nikki, who's one of our lecturers in the department. And she's actually riding one of her horses here, and you can see she's got the gas analysis equipment on. And she's actually got some bandages, I don't know if you can see, around her arms. You can see them on Phys on the right. And they've got some electrodes measuring muscle activity at the same time. So these pictures are all from my last trial, so it was my exciting trial. So I get them in the lab, I get them jumping with all the kit on. It's pretty groovy. So I'm going to just talk you through each phase and what I've found. At the moment, I'm not presenting a lot of data to you because I want to wait till it's peer reviewed and published so that you can actually use it. Because what I find is sometimes I say bits of information and then students start citing it as taken. And it is, and it will be, but it's not out there yet. So it's kind of like I want you to take it and then use it, but not necessarily use the data yet until it's out there. Okay, so the first study I did was basically like an infield study. It's probably my most logistically challenging study that I did. But I looked at physiological demands of novice one-day eventing, and excuse my pictures behind me, it's like my shrine. So for those of you that don't know, I live in Canada, and I don't see my friends and family an awful lot. So in my office, I have a shrine to my family. But anyway, my first study was physiological demands of novice one-day eventing, and logistically challenging. We had to get governing body consent. It probably took me 6 months to plan and implement, which, considering I was doing this full time, is a long time. I was also pregnant, so I was running around pregnant, and because those of you that event, you don't get your times usually till like the Thursday evening for the weekend, and so I would be ringing people saying, I'm going to do you at 10, and then I'd have to try and work out who was going to which event and then what time their dressage should show them. And I had a grooming kit, like a waist grooming kit, and I had my lactate strips and my lactate testers, my hand grip strength, and I just looked like a nutter running around. It was really fun and extremely tiring. I had to go camping at lots of different events. I was basically, in the 2010 eventing season, I was at pretty much most events around the UK, camping either in my car or in a tent. And it was fun. It was good fun. I learnt a lot from doing it. But I don't necessarily want to do it again in a hurry. It was hard work by myself. But what we found out was cardiac demands are high for all three phases and does, as you would suspect, increase with each phase. So as dressage was the lowest and cross-country was the highest. And blood lactate was quite low compared to the relative cardiac responses. So we're getting 80 to 90% max heart rate for the whole duration, but then only like a 5 ml blood lactate accumulation, which is quite low. And I also measured grip strength, so we found out that grip strength decreases significantly, particularly in the dominant hand, which indicates that we're either that arm fatigues quicker or we're using it more, one or the other. So study 2 was a lab-based test, and I got novice, intermediate and advanced BE affiliated event riders to come into the lab. So I had 27 riders. I had a fairly even, I forget the exact split, but a relatively even. There's like 8 to 10 in each group. And I did a series of tests, and I did masses of them. I did reaction tests on the Batak wall, I did single leg balance tests, I did VO2 max tests, I did press ups. You can see some of the pictures at the bottom. So on the left there, that's the isokinetic dynamometer that I was telling you about. So it's like the death chair. People used to come in and be like, oh my goodness, what is this? And you can use it for loads of different body parts, but we just did knee flexion extension, so quad hamstring strength. And we did it at slow speeds and fast speeds and all sorts of things. And then we actually used a bike. So I've said already that my third study showed that you probably should use the treadmill. So in hindsight, treadmill's the way to go. But we did VO2 max testing, we did lactate threshold testing, press ups, plank fatigue, wall squats, lots and lots of tests. Like, it took hours. And I also did like questionnaire based data with them. Anyway, the general finding from this was that isometric trunk and quadricep strength was a determinant of performance in this population of event riders. So your advanced event riders were outperforming your novice event riders and the intermediate for these isometric tests. So when I started to look at the research behind isometric strength, because as a travel sport, generally we're not destabilizing the body that much. We're trying to actually, unlike most sports, we're trying to throw, catch, run. This sport, we're actually just trying to stay on something. So it's very similar to motor sports, water sports, and those sort of things. And I actually found some really interesting information about isometric physiology. And my first study with the heart rate, blood lactate was kind of odd, and then this was leaning to isometric strength. So I started to look into that a little bit more. And I started to think that maybe the isometric... So for any of you that know, like if you have a client that has hypertension, so if you have someone that has high blood pressure, you don't do isometric moves with them because it can increase the blood pressure. And actually, like some of the research in sailors and other sports like that have suggested that actually heart rate and oxygen consumption don't have this linear increase that we see in dynamic sports. And actually what happens is the heart rate increases because of a blood pressure barrier reflex, but the requirement for oxygen stays low. So your actual like fitness in terms of like aerobic fitness is low, but your heart rate goes up because of blood pressure, which is really interesting. So that is something that I started to think that perhaps we see in riders. So that was what my last study decided to test. But I had to do an intermediary study, so I'll just take you to the next slide. So I had these two studies that lended itself, and originally my third study was going to be the strength conditioning intervention, but I don't know, I just didn't feel that I had enough data to really understand the physiological demand and therefore implement a training intervention. So myself and my supervisors decided that because of the data, it was relatively ambiguous. We thought we wanted to understand more about the physiology of horse riding before we went to a training intervention. So the whole nature of the PhD kind of changed course a little bit. And one of the things that we were discussing was the fact that if we didn't actually attain a true VO2 max on the bike and actually the numbers were lower, perhaps what was happening was that we were saying that they were working at 90% of their max when maybe they were only working at 70. So we decided we needed to do a methodological study for study 3. So then for study 3, we decided to do a lab-based methods trial. And we basically looked at VO2 max or VO2 peak in 3 different modes. We looked at it on a mechanical horse, as you can see here. We looked at it on a cyclogometer and on a treadmill. Basically, the VO2 peak on the treadmill was about 8 mils per minute higher, which is quite a significant increase than it was on the cyclogometer. And we found out that this mechanical horse that you can see in this picture did not replicate horse riding from a physiological perspective at all. So definitely don't use it for physiological testing. And that we should be using treadmill if we want to establish VO2 peak. So from now on, that could be one of the reasons why we're predicting VO2 to be so high, and therefore from now on we need to use the treadmill for our laboratory reference mode. Okay, so my last trial was so hard to do. I basically had to measure heart rate, blood lactate, EMG, so I measured muscle activity of the forearms, the abdominals, the upper back, the quads, and I'll tell you the specific muscles at a later date, but that's effectively the areas we decided to look at. And we looked at respiratory frequency, oxygen uptake, ventilatory threshold, blood lactate, heart rate, oxygen consumption. And we did that in walk, sitting trot, rising trot, canter, unseated canter, a fast canter, so like a gallop around the arena, and then a jump. We did like an on-horse exercise test. They went up in 2-minute stages and they just kept going up and up and up and up and up. And it was quite logistically challenging to set up and do, but we did it. And so I'm just crunching the numbers and writing the rest of the thesis now, but essentially we do see this, in my opinion, we see this discrepancy between heart rate and oxygen consumption. The oxygen consumption is relatively stable, and yes, it does change between walk, trot, canter, jump, but it doesn't have the same increase that we see with heart rate. So heart rate increases at a much faster rate than we see with oxygen consumption. And when we look at some of the other studies in sailing, it has actually a much greater difference between the heart rate and the VO2. And they have suggested there's this dissociation in heart rate VO2, which suggests that we see an even greater dissociation. And they think one of the reasons for that is because of this isometric muscle activity, this is why we measured the muscle activity. What's basically happening is the blood is pooling the muscles, and there's no way, because it's not dynamic, there's no way for the blood to get around the body. And so we see an increased heart rate demand because the heart's trying to pump harder to get the blood around the body as a blood pressure response. So basically, this is why we get like sort of fatigue in the legs and the upper back and in the core, because we're getting this sort of static, or this is what I haven't measured blood flow through the muscle in riders, so I can't say that's definitely what it is. But looking at the other physiological data and my data, it would lend itself quite nicely that this might be what it is. Now, you're going to have to be careful with how you use that, because it's my data and it's not in peer review yet. So I want you to use it and think about future research, but I don't necessarily think it would be wise for you to start citing that yet, because it's not actually peer reviewed, so it's still my word against the world. But this on-horse incremental exercise test, we actually, it's far more physiologically replicable to sport-specific data than mechanical horse was. So we might actually be able to do an on-horse test in the future, because we did see, even though there's a dissociation between heart rate and VO2, we did actually see a relationship between the two measures. So what happens is they do this. So they still go up, there's still a relationship, but they just don't go up together. You can't really see. They don't go up that way, they don't go up together, they go up like this. But there's still a relationship, so we can use like regression analysis to predict if your heart rate is this, your VO2 is likely to be this. So when I have the data, you will be the first people to know it, like when I have it to give it to you. But that's what it looks like it happens, and therefore we need to train our riders. Like we need to train our riders to get used to that muscle blood flow being restricted for prolonged periods of time. So I'm really excited about it, and there's far more to it than I'm able to tell you in this lecture. But what we're saying is that sport-specific strength conditioning is necessary in riders. We're getting physiological responses that we don't see in dynamic sports, and we need to train them in the gym in a way that is going to be able to help them when they're on the horse. So yeah, that was my final study, and I'm really excited to be able to like share it with everybody and share it with you properly in a journal. Hopefully medicine and science and exercise and sport, I think, is the journal that we're going for. So hopefully it'll be there soon. So that's a bit of a background about physiology of riding. So in terms of myself, what am I doing with my PhD? I'm just at the write-up stage. So I should be handing in any point this year. But what we know so far is that heart rate demands are far greater than the oxygen requirement observed, and there's moderate blood lactate accumulation. So we should be training our riders to offset lactate threshold, particularly in disciplines where they're going to come out of their seat and jump. And we should be training them to be able to cope with this isometric muscle fatigue and the blood pooling that we can assume that is happening. So in terms of what's next, like I'm now really excited by all the research I've done, and I hope that I bring something new to the equestrian community once the data's all released and peer reviewed. But I want to re-educate riders. I want to revolutionise the way we think about strength conditioning riders, and I want to get riders to get results as a result of it, because horse riding is complex and very specific. And the way I think about it is, if riders always do what they've always done, they're always going to get what they've always got. And I want to reverse the current thinking of rider fitness. So I'm on a mission over here in Canada to create a platform for riders to learn about the demands of horse riding and to learn about how they can implement that into their training. Now, whether that's something they do with me or their own trainer. So I've actually developed an online training program or programs for riders, and I called it Event Fit. And that's something that I'm doing. So I'm now using the research and actually getting out there and trying to spread the word with riders. So I hope you enjoy this lecture. I'm sorry that I can't interact with you personally, but hopefully you've got some information for it and you know where to take your reading next. But in conclusion, it's the forward seat position and the jump-in efforts that seem to increase cardiovascular and respiratory demand. And if you think about why this is, if you think about the leg and the trunk musculature that is going to be required, so it's like a high amplitude isometric contraction, because if you think about the demand of landing after jumping, you have to tense quite a lot, and there's other things involved, like for example, how many of you have had to do singing or breathing exercise when you're jumping because you might hold your breath, or if you try to brace your spine and breathe at the same time, it's quite difficult. So if you pretend someone's going to go punch you in the guts now, you brace, and it's quite difficult. You can still breathe, but it's more difficult. So presumably when you're doing lots of repeated jumping efforts, your respiratory frequency decreases, which it does because I recorded it. And so you're getting a reduced amount of oxygen because of this blood pooling, and then you're getting more so because you're not breathing. So there's so much about, because a lot of the research and a lot of the training that you see out there is so specific for dressage riders and good posture and core strength, and yes, but there's core stability and core strength are kind of intertwined together but different, and therefore like having a good reaction, good core reaction, good spinal stiffening and straightening is something that we can train through from different methods than perhaps are being employed at the moment. So I think it's important when we're thinking about training the rider that we always come back to the fact that the primary method of training is going to be through riding itself. And if it was between doing a strength training and riding an extra horse, then depending on who you are and your training status, then riding that extra horse might be better for you than time in the gym. But Vicky, I know, is going to talk about the strength conditioning interventions later, so I won't stampede on that lecture. But we have evidence that you want to be off your horse in training, because it's something that you won't be able to replicate on the horse. Well, obviously you will, but it's something that would be difficult to do for a long period of time, but we can replicate it off the horse quite easily. So this brings me to the end of my lecture. So I want to thank you for sitting through the last hour and 15 minutes or however long it's been. And I hope that I've given you some food for thought about physiological demand, and I've given you some information about papers to read. And like I said, there might be one or two that I haven't mentioned because I just haven't included them in my literature review as much as I know there's another one on blood lactate and attention in riders, and there's loads of ones on asymmetry, and I haven't included those. I stuck purely to physiology, so I don't think there's that many more. But what I'd like you to do in a response to this lecture is read the following papers. So you've got a list of papers there, and I want you to read them and critique the methods, and then think about, if you were going to do some research in this area, how you could be more effective with the research and which avenue you would take in. And the difficulty you're going to have here is it could be taken in so many different avenues that you're going to get a little bit mind blown. So I want you to just focus on one. So choose a discipline and then focus in on something. And then if it is something that you want to do in the future, then hit me up and I will be happy to talk you through any ideas. So I just want to thank you again for listening, and just a reminder, my email is Jenny, JENNI.Douglas, DOUGLAS @heartbury.ac.uk, and I am happy to do a video on question and answers. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, happy to help with research and with dissertations. And also, why don't you check me out on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. You can probably find me by looking for Event Fit, and my website will go live soon, and I'd be happy to you'll see lectures and demos and videos and things on there. So thank you for listening. Thanks Vicky for asking me to do this lecture, and yeah, have a great rest of the weekend, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks then, bye. Okay guys, thanks for listening to this lecture. I just want to reiterate that I will be here to answer any questions that you have, whether that's via email or whether you'd like me to do a question and answer video. If there's anything that you want to go through in preparation for your exam or your assignments, I would be absolutely happy to help, and I would love to hear from you if you have any ideas about dissertation. So my email's up here on the screen, and I'll let Vicky get in touch with me, or you get in touch with me directly if you want to hear more. Thanks again, bye!